Well, Stuart, it's great to have a conversation with you. We met back in the days when I was in Canberra.
Yes.
You in those days were a greatly respected history man at a greatly respected historical institution, the Department of History at Macquarie University.
Those were the days when I was greatly respected, yes. But the department is still greatly respected. You're right about that.
What I didn't know then is that you were already well into writing a really interesting and very thoroughly researched history of the influence of evangelicalism on the establishment and growth and even the prosperity and well-being and freedoms of this country we love, Australia.
I was in America on a study leave at Yale, and I received a letter from a Scottish historian, Ian Murray, who actually wrote a book on Christianity in Australia. And he wanted me to write a book for the bicentenary. I'd been studying all the great evangelicals, Wesley and Jonathan Edwards and these people. I wasn't particularly interested in studying Australian history, but I received an enormous research grant in order to do just that for the bicentenary. And so this is the product of that research. It's taken me 30 years to write it. But I'm at last delivering on the investment. And what I'm delivering is two very large books, really, on the history of evangelical Christianity in Australia. I at first wanted to call it The Missing Story, because so much of this has been left out of our history. And when you put it in, it makes all the difference. It just completely changes our understanding of what history is all about, starting right from the beginning. I mean, there are all these histories about how awful the treatment of the first settlers were in Australia and how callous the government was. Complete myth. You know, the government put an enormous amount of effort into getting it right and making sure that it was a great success. People at the time regarded this as one of the greatest sociological experiments, as someone said, of all time. It was such a dramatic thing. And just to dismiss it as a callous, dumping of people we didn't want on the other side of the world just completely misses the point.
Well, let's go back to basics a bit here first. You and I would both say history is incredibly important. And I've noticed actually that many of the people that I most respect in leadership positions, in politics, in the military, wherever, they read a lot of history. Why is history important? Why does it matter?
History is the way of arriving at true knowledge, because history is essentially the study of human experience, and from that comes an understanding of reality. If you don't study what people have actually done in the past, then you don't really know what reality is. And also from that comes wisdom and inspiration for the future. I mean, history is all about the future. I'm very interested in the relationship between science and history, and what the scientists are showing in connection with dementia. When people get very serious dementia and they lose their memories of the past, then they can no longer envision the future. If we in Australia lose all contact with our past, then we don't have a future. So no past, no future, no history, no heritage, no culture. It's quite a serious problem. And nowadays in our universities, there is less and less emphasis on the humanities and history in particular. That's really retrograde.
Karl Marx commented that if you can deprive a people of an understanding of their history, they are easily persuaded. You're saying history is important. It seems an immediate follow-on to that would be to say it needs to be history you can trust.
Yes, absolutely. If the history is misguided, if there are significant elements of it left out, if it's distorted in some way, then we're in big trouble. And that's what I think has happened in a lot of Australian history. The secular historians have left the religious component out, and it's a pretty serious omission, because what it does is that it leaves out an explanation of what we really are as Australians, because it leaves out an account of our values. Our values are essentially Christian. And I've noticed in the debate on values that our secular historians, they give up on it very quickly because they don't have anything to say about it. They mock it. They poo-poo it as a ridiculous enterprise. They're embarrassed by it. But a Christian perspective on this, I think, would have a lot to say about Australian values.
Well, interestingly then, you don't begin your history with the story of the first fleet in the early colony. You begin it earlier, 1740 or so. Why?
1740 was the year of the Evangelical revival in England, the Great Awakening in America, the Réveil in Europe, a general revitalisation of Christianity at the time, which had an enormous impact on English and American and European social life. And from this, the founders of Australia, by this, the founders of Australia were greatly influenced. So the energy to launch the Australian missile was really launched, I think, in the Great Awakening. And in the book I do it not only sort of in general terms, but specifically in human terms, because as you know, John, the great preacher of the Evangelical revival, George Whitfield, you know, we just lost Billy Graham, another of the greats of the preaching world. But George Whitfield is often held to be the greatest preacher. And one of his many converts was Margaret Gambier. Margaret Gambier was of a Huguenot family. They were Protestants who had come across from France in the persecutions. And Margaret Gambier was converted under George Whitfield's ministry, and she married Charles Middleton, and they settled in Margaret's home in Barham Court in Teesson in Kent. It's spelled T-E-S-T-O-N, but I believe it's pronounced Teesson in Kent. And they gathered around them the people who eventually abolished slavery. I mean, the great founder of the abolition of slavery was Charles Middleton's minister, James Ramsay.
Yeah. He was a Scot.
He was a Scot.
Yeah.
And Charles Middleton was appointed by Pitt to be the controller of the Navy.
So appointed by the Prime Minister.
By the Prime Minister.
To head up the Navy.
To head up the Navy. And under Charles Middleton's regime, it became stronger than it had ever been before, which is saying something because it had been a strong navy hitherto.
Because Britain was the superpower.
Superpower.
And the Royal Navy really did rule the seas.
Absolutely. And yet he made it stronger than ever. He was a very good administrator. And being a devout Christian, he believed that administration is a form of ministry. I mean, it's the same word, administration, ministry. And people who are involved in administration should do it properly. He believed that very strongly. He believed that religion was essential for the public ideal to achieve what it should be in British life. He was a very good appointment of Pitt's to head up the Navy, and he was the one who was personally responsible for choosing the 11 ships of the First Fleet. Now again, the historians who want to rubbish all of this say, you know, they put the convicts in these old wrecks and send them out. There was no ship that was older than 6 years.
They all made it.
And not only did they make it within 2 days of each other. This was the most remarkable maritime achievement of the age and was recognised by people at the time as being a sensational achievement. And, hardly any loss of life. 1,000 people on these boats, and they lost, I think, 30 on the way out. And some of them they lost because they jumped ship. But another factor in all of this was that they appointed a contractor, and he was another Christian, Richards, another Scot. He was baptised in Dover Presbyterian Church, and he made sure that the provisions on the ships were such that convicts became, they were better fed than they'd ever been before. When they got off the ship at the end of the voyage, they were heavier than when they got on. The soldiers too. They provided more food for the convicts than they provided for the soldiers and the Marines and the Navy.
Really?
Absolutely.
Let's contextualise this just for a bit more. I think one of the great challenges for historians who glibly say, oh, our freedoms, our values, all the wonderful things we have as Australians, we inherited from the Enlightenment. The truth is that at the time of this ferment, slavery was regarded as normal. Women were regarded as inferior, and racism was regarded as normal and an accepted part of human existence. All of the major Enlightenment figures thought that way, and yet the moral impulse to turn all of that on its head and to view people regardless of their status in life, or whether even if they were convicts or if they had black skin and were regarded as slaves, the moral impulse to change all of that actually didn't come from the Enlightenment.
I agree with you. The subject of humanitarianism, and how it suddenly became a feature in public life in the 18th century, it's a very interesting historical problem. Where did it come from? And as you say, it doesn't seem to have come from the Enlightenment really, because Enlightenment figures continued to hold those things that you've just mentioned. One historian talks about the evangelical humanitarian confluence. That's where it comes from, I think. It comes from the desire to reform everything, to make everything better. So there are the Wesleys, for example, eager to get into prisons and reform prisons. And indeed, that's how the first settlement came about, really, because it came about from a desire to do something more for prisoners. The Evangelical said, well, I don't think transportation's a great idea, but it's better than hanging people. I mean, the Evangelicals were the people who were, in Australia, eventually, were the ones who were most instrumental in abolishing transportation. But at this particular point, it was a far more merciful thing than that existed in England at the moment. And as my book begins, it begins with an assassination attempt on King George III, and he suddenly became terribly interested as a result in prisons and prison reform, and as a result of that, the whole thing got underway, and Pitt came up with this new way of doing things. And he had the help of Wilberforce and company, and Pitt said to Wilberforce, find me a chaplain.
Yeah.
And so that's how Richard Johnson came to be appointed.
Let's contextualise this a bit more. You've got a great passion for this as a historian, as do I. I have a great passion after 19 years in the federal parliament too for freedom and for politics that work and deliver and secure good outcomes for people. That's very rare. Human history is pretty long now, but the sort of lifestyles and things we take for granted have only emerged in the period that you start with your book, with that Great Awakening. The American historian Hochschild in Bury the Chain says that at that time, and he's a secularist, probably 3/4 of the world's population were serfs or slaves. They had no economic or personal or political freedom. It's a staggering thing. And yet there's enormous movement, this ferment that was taking place that was to so change England, led to, amongst other things, the greatest human rights movement of all times, the abolition of slavery. It was so successful that it changed the way the world thought and thinks to this day. So we know we still have slavery, which is horrendous, but we all abhor it now. In those days, when Australia was settled, it was part of the norm. And yet here you had a group of people that have been airbrushed out of history, that were revolutionising the most powerful society on earth, which was also the one that colonised us. And we are the beneficiaries. We stand, I would suggest, on the shoulders of giants. So I think this is really important. Let's tease out a little more this extraordinary rise of what might be called serious and enthusiastic religion. They were probably critical words in those days, but they were accurate words. They took it seriously. They took their God seriously, and they took their fellow men seriously in a way that was new.
I am really a religious historian, and therefore I suppose I'm focusing on the religious component to explain that development. But it always intrigues me that the founders of this evangelical movement, and by evangelical I mean those who insisted on having a vital experience of Jesus Christ and who attribute to the Bible chief authority in their lives, the founders of this movement, I think really it sort of grew out of the evangelical revival, produced the evangelical revival and then grew out of it. They were incredible people. I mean, Wesley was a very marvellous human being with a big brain who paid a lot of attention to the importance of reason. It's not the Enlightenment that has a monopoly on reason. Wesley was very good at that. But the great genius of the evangelical revival was the American philosopher theologian Jonathan Edwards. He was an exceptional talent. He was one of the great brains of Christian history. And I don't think that, you talk about we're on the shoulders of giants. I don't think we've ever had people like that again. And as for the political world, Wilberforce's influence was just gigantic. Wilberforce had a lot to do with the choice of governors for New South Wales, school teachers for New South Wales, ministers for New South Wales. Wilberforce corresponded with these great long sentences which you've got there in your wonderful book, John.
The first American printing of the booklet. The publishers said, "It won't sell, Mr. Wilberforce, but we'll run a few off because it's your name on it." And it went through multiple editions in many languages.
Yes, and tell us what it is, John. It's the practical view.
It's the practical view. He describes the difference between what he saw as real Christianity and nominal Christianity, which was so common.
That's right.
And you had, as you say, the Wesleyan and George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards influences. In many ways they influenced the great masses. Yes. But this group of people started to work out how to influence the decision makers of the day. And you've fascinatingly unveiled that people like Middleton wanted to see the First Fleet succeed, and they believed in the rehabilitation of the convicts, not just getting them out of the way. That clashes, doesn't it, a bit with the sort of history we learn at school?
Yes, it does, doesn't it? And what I wanted to do in the book was to explain how this very intense religion which developed out of the evangelical revival and was a very intense personal religion, so that it insisted on everybody having a personal experience of Jesus Christ, are you saved and all the rest of it. But it became, by the time Australia was settled, it had become public religion. It was something which had to influence the public sphere. It had to shape policy. There was a Secretary of State for the colonies who received from one of his acolytes a very interesting observation. I've quoted it at length in the book, and I can't remember what it says precisely, but in summary it says this: look, for 100 years, we people in public life have been able to ignore the importance of religion. But suddenly, the majority of the population is consumed by this subject. They've been influenced by the evangelical revival. They've been influenced by Wesley and Methodism and Whitefield and all these sort of people. This became a vital issue for them. And he said, if we don't respond to this, address this, take this into account, then we're missing out on something which is huge. So by the time Australia was settled, I think, it was settled by people who had a very strong grasp of the importance of a biblical and Christian perspective on public policy. It made all the difference, in terms of humanitarianism. This is very critical for today.
Yes.
Because I take it because of but accentuated by all the talk about sexual abuse and so on. There's a lot of talk now about keeping religion out of the public square, about not funding anything to do with religious institutions, about withdrawing taxation exemptions from churches and all the rest of it. And I think it's understandable that people think that, because this sexual abuse stuff has been horrific.
We'd all agree on that.
Absolutely appalling.
No excuse for it at all.
Absolutely. So the great danger is that people, for understandable reasons, will want to overreact, I think, and get rid of religion altogether. You've got, however, not to do that ideologically or even emotionally, but you've got to work out what price you pay if you do that. And I think we can work out what the price will be if we think about it calmly. There was an Australian religious values survey done in 1983. It's the only time that this has been addressed, to my knowledge. And what it talks about is what do churchgoers contribute to the society, and how do they differ from people who are not churchgoers? And in 1983 anyway, the difference between the contribution of the two is incredible. I mean, churchgoers are 5.5 times more likely to be involved in human rights groups, and 3.5 times involved in youth groups, and they pay their taxes, and they are healthier, and they stay married longer, and all these sort of statistics. It's really a very big difference between the two. And I came to the conclusion, having looked at this stuff, that the best thing the government could do in the interests of the development of Australia would be to fund churches, not to withdraw it. It really is I'm joking about this a bit, but it is a serious matter, and we should be pretty careful about withdrawing support for the churches. We'd pay a big price for it, I think.
Well, let's swing now.
I mean, just one more point, and that is that in Australia, unlike America and England, the great majority of our charities are Christian.
Yeah.
In terms of money, about top 80% are Christian.
But let's jump back now to some of the fascinating stuff you unveil in your book. Okay. We've begun the conversation about the First Fleet. It's a remarkable effort. You've established for us that it was very well organised because the evangelicals thought that was important. It was seen as humanitarian. They were not blind to the downsides, but they saw that this was a better way than the alternatives. What about those who would say, well, it was to impact very badly, and let's be frank, it wasn't always at all a good story, but what about their motivation and their understanding of the impact on the people who were already here, the Aboriginal people?
On the Aboriginal people?
Yeah.
Yes. This also is a very important question for today. My take on it is that the need for the reconciliation of the white Australians with the Indigenous people is a work for the future, because it's not been achieved in the past. And it would be a pity if the Christian contribution were removed from the development of policy to do with the reconciliation of Aboriginal people. In the past, the people who stood between the Aboriginal people and extinction were the missionaries, and evangelical pastoralists and people like that who had a belief that Aboriginal people were of one blood with them. Aboriginal people were human beings. Aboriginal people were not inferior in terms of academic ability and all these sorts of things, which is what was commonly believed by many others who didn't share the biblical beliefs of evangelical Christians.
Despite the Enlightenment.
Despite the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment came up with the idea of the noble savage, but with Christianity, evangelicals never thought of Aboriginal people as being barbarians. They thought that the people who mistreated them were barbarians because they thought of barbarism in terms of morality. And if you treat people appallingly, then that's barbaric. That was their definition of a barbarian. So the few successes which there have been in the past to do with the uplifting of Aboriginal people, the preservation of destruction and so on, tends to have come from Christians and missionaries. Even a secular historian like Reynolds, who has written a lot about this, he talks about the people who were involved in protecting the Aboriginal people. He doesn't identify them as being evangelical Christians, but that's what they were. If you look at them all, they were all, for the most part, evangelical Christians. I was surprised to find because you read a lot about Catholic missionaries, because some of the Catholic missionaries were very famous, particularly in Western Australia. But they were a very small minority compared with the Protestants. Once the Protestants got going, first of all, the German missionaries were the most successful in the 19th century. They were appointed by Governor La Trobe, who was a friend of Wilberforce. I mean, he was a grandson of the La Trobes, who were friends of Wilberforce. They're all interconnected.
All interconnected.
And
it's a big family.
It's a big family, and they understood that these German missionaries would make a success, whereas none of the other missionaries had succeeded in the past. There was one failure after another. They tried hard, but the cultural difference was so enormous. I think the gap between European civilisation and Aboriginal culture is so enormous that it's taken all this time to begin to understand it. I begin the book with Lieutenant Dawes, who was stunning in his sensitivity to what was going on, his wonderment at this culture that he'd come across. He'd never come across a culture like this before. It's a great pity that people didn't follow in his steps. But there was chronic failure after failure. But the ones who began to succeed were the German missionaries who were appointed by Governor La Trobe. By the beginning of the 20th century, you get the development of missions in the remote parts of Australia, where the Aboriginal people had not been so contaminated as they had been in the south and the east, where things had chronically failed. And those missions tended to be reasonably successful. But I think that and the movement for land rights, for Aboriginal land rights and all the rest of it, WIC and so on, has a lot to do with particularly with the Evangelical, with the Aboriginal revival. There's an amazing Aboriginal revival in 1979, which went on for a number of years. And a lot of those new movements have come out of that. They were given the energy, the moral energy, to persevere with these things until they began to make some achievement. But I still think, right to this very present, that it's still a work for the future. But why I'm so optimistic about the value of the presence of Christianity is that Christianity gives you all the vocabulary to deal with this. Christianity talks about reconciliation. Christianity talks about atonement. Christianity talks about forgiveness. All the things and the recognition that we whites have some responsibility for what's happened to our Indigenous brothers, and gives us the compassion and the love to do something about it. I think this is the great challenge for modern Australia. I don't think we should rest until we have dealt with this problem.
I agree with that. Interestingly, a little bit of history from the electorate that I represented. The dreadful Mile Creek massacre of women and children in the early 1830s was to result in the first hangings of whites for murdering blacks.
The only hanging of whites for murdering blacks.
And in fact, the first trial, the whites were released. And one of the jurors commented, "I will never see a white man hang for killing a black." But it was the Catholic community, to their great credit in Sydney, that agitated for a retrial that produced a different result.
Yes, the judge was Plunkett, who was a Catholic. And he said that what you have done is a stain which cries to high heaven for redress.
But again, let's go back to the First Fleet. So we've established its success and that the motivation was different and more honourable than that which is so often presented in school history, for want of a better term. Let's come to the second and the third fleets, which were vastly different stories. What happened there?
Yes, I think what might have happened is that the government saw that it had spent so much money on the First Fleet.
Doing it properly.
It was a very expensive operation, so well provisioned and so on. They tried to do it on the cheap, and so they employed this firm, Camden, Calvert and King, who had been involved in the slave trade. And so they just treated the convicts as if they were on the slave ships. And in the Second Fleet, there were 1,100 convicts who were brought out. 267 of them died. I mean, it was just appalling. And when the government woke up to this, they said, well, we better go back to Richard, the Presbyterian guy, and get him to do it again. So he sent out 3 ships, sometimes called the Fourth Fleet, because there was a Third Fleet which is also appalling. And the Fourth Fleet, if it was that, it was 3 ships, lost 1 life.
Incredible.
Absolutely incredible.
It's a powerful story. And I would, with respect, suggest to those historians who want to gloss over the influence of real Christian faith. Wilberforce's book is about the difference between real faith and nominal faith.
Yes. That's what evangelical Christianity is, by the way. It's all about taking
it seriously.
Nominal faith, real faith.
Yeah,
that's right.
And the challenge for historians who want to gloss over that is to explain it. You know, here's a reality. Those who had a deep real Christian concern for humanity, oversaw the First Fleet and the Fourth, which by any standards were remarkably well executed and humanely executed. The middle ones were run by the militant secularists of the day, those engaged in slave trading, and the humanitarian outcomes were appalling. And in fact turned out to be a serious drain on the struggling colony.
I was not terribly surprised to find this when I went looking for it, even though the secular historians hadn't talked about it at all. Because by the time I'd turned to studying that, I had come to the conclusion that we'd been making mistakes about lots of other things as well. And the things that you discover almost by accident are the things which really impact upon you. You think, what? This is amazing. And I had 2 such discoveries, which really explains how this book came to be written, I think. The first happened when I was making a study of a mine disaster. It was Australia's biggest disaster before the recent Victorian bushfires, which took 180 lives or something. Well, the Mount Kembla mine disaster of 1902 took 96 lives, our biggest disaster on land. But when I made a study of this disaster, I found to my astonishment that just months before the explosion, which killed all these people, there'd been a genuine religious revival in Mount Kembla and all the mining communities along the coast in 1902. 131 people added to the church in Mount Kembla, 292 added to the church in Bulli, and so on. And I thought, what? I'd followed the stereotype that there had never been a religious revival in Australia. I thought that religious revival was an American thing. So when I got looking for it, I began to find that Australians, who are meant to be impervious to religious sensitivities and so on, so we're told, you know, we're the land of amiable pagans who don't take religious things seriously. Every now and again, they can exhibit right across the board spiritual hunger. I found also in 1906, by the way, I don't think this is even in the book, but in 1906 there was a record crowd of people who went to the new art gallery in Sydney, passing through the turntable at 3 per second. 300,000 people visited, out of a population of 500,000 in Sydney at the time. They went to see a particular painting, and the painting was William Holman Hunt's Light of the World.
Is that right?
And people apparently bowed down in front of it. People wept in front of it. This is 1906. This is like 1959 with Billy Graham, again when all of Australia was affected, you know, and 3.25 million people heard Billy Graham. 1.24 accepted his invitation to come to Christ. And Billy Graham himself said, this is the deepest spiritual hunger I've ever seen anywhere. This is Australia. So that was one discovery. But the other discovery was even more significant than that, I think, in my opinion. I had a class at Wollongong University where I was a teacher. And one year I said to them, how about we write a history of the churches of the Illawarra? And you can, for an essay, you can all take one church and write a history of that church. So my class joined me in writing this book, and we wrote a book called Faith of Steel. But when we listed all the churches, you know, when they were open, we found, to my astonishment, that in any particular community, these 4 churches were all opened at about the same time: Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, often on opposite street corners. And then, you know, a generation later, somebody in one of the churches would say, I want a more handsome church. I want a stone church instead of a brick church, or I want a Gothic revival church instead of a Romanesque church, or whatever, you know. And so they'd pull down their church and they'd put up this new handsome church, and all the others would do the same. You know, and the writer Anthony Trollope, who came to Australia, said Australians love building churches. He said in every community there is a church, or rather, he said, churches. You know. Now, this all came about, I've since discovered, partly because of Governor Burke and his Church Acts, where he said that he would subsidise the building of churches in every community, and he would subsidise payment for ministers. So those 4 churches took advantage of that. The Baptists and the Congregationalists did not, and so they remained very small. But the other 4, they built these churches. Now, again, the secular historians, I think they get this wrong. What they say is that this shows a decline of Christianity.
Needed propping up.
Well, not only it shows that secularisation was taking place because they were no longer willing to impose upon the Australian people the Anglican Church. So this is the beginning of secularisation, they say. This is going downhill. But Governor Burke, he was no secular figure. He was a very devout Christian. His wife was the daughter of Spencer Perceval, the Evangelical Prime Minister of Great Britain. And Governor Burke had prayer meetings in the government house. I mean, this guy was really the real thing. He believed that the way to help the community to make progress out of its rather inauspicious origins was to get the churches involved. And so in every community you get these 4 churches. Now, another thing that the historians say as well, this is where sectarianism comes from. And the history of Christianity in Australia, particularly the 19th century, is all about sectarianism, these Christians squabbling with each other. Well, no wonder. Here you are funding these 4 churches. No wonder they squabble with each other. But this is historians dealing with conflict. Historians love to deal with conflict. But what you will find if you study it most of the time is they weren't in conflict. They were cooperating with each other. I call it, throughout the book, I call it holy emulation, sanctified competition. They really learnt from each other. And as a result, every community had this incredible presence of Christian ministry. 4 ministers in small communities. Not just one as you would have in Britain, but 4. Which I think helps to explain why Australia has become what I would argue is one of the most Christianised nations on earth in terms of values. Because we imbibed these Christian values from all these ministers. So this multiplication of churches, which we still see in all the country towns of New South Wales and so on, has a very important history and a very important impact on Australian society. So I thought, well, secular historians have got that wrong. They've got the revival bit wrong. Maybe they've got other things wrong as well. And I started to look for these other things and started to find them all over the place. This young historian from Canberra, Michael Gladwin, has written a history of chaplains. He's come to the conclusion, he's argued in his books, that the real founders of culture in Australia, the ones who laid the foundation for Australian culture, they were chaplains. They were ministers of religion.
So talking of chaplains, the first chaplain, of course, was here because of the influence of William Wilberforce and his very wealthy and influential friends, including the Prime Minister. They decided together there had to be a chaplain and he had to be sent out with good materials, literature, teaching materials, because he set up the first educational institutions, and Bibles. They arrive here. What happens? Is there a service immediately they hit the deck or firm land?
No. They landed in Sydney Cove on the 26th of January, Australia Day nowadays, and so the first Sunday was the 27th. And of course the secular historians say, proves that Australia has never been religious because they didn't hold a service on the first Sunday. the first service was held on the 3rd of February, the second Sunday. And my belief is that the reason for that is that Richard Johnson put a lot of effort into getting it right. This was something that you would want to do correctly because, after all, they've just finished this magnificent voyage out from England. There was a lot to give thanks for. You've got to get it right. And you have to find somewhere for 800 people to congregate because there were the 570 odd male convicts and the 240 odd Marines who were all going to be at that service. The women weren't allowed off until a few days after that. So Johnson had to find a space for 800 to worship the Lord, and that's why I think he chose that particular spot. You know, if you come up from what is now Circular Quay, what was then Sydney Cove, this is the first reasonably flat area. It falls away dramatically down towards George Street and then down towards Circular Quay. And the text of the first sermon, and it was Lieutenant Ralph Clark who wrote back to his wife saying, "Heard a very good sermon." Well, the text of the sermon was, "What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits to me?" And the historians say, well, this is the insensitivity of Christians. They've got to realise that the convicts wouldn't have been thinking about benefits. This is an awful place. And yet Johnson would have been very conscious of the magnificent voyage which they'd had and the blessings of that voyage. You know, they left Plymouth on the 13th of May, 252 days before. They'd had fair winds nearly all the way. They didn't have any problems anywhere. It was just a terrific voyage out. And I think that Johnson would also have been giving thanks for the people who made all this responsible, who were responsible for making all this possible, for Wilberforce and Middleton and all those people who put the whole thing together in the first place. They were very grateful for the men who had taken time to attend to their real needs, and they were conscious that as a result of their compassion and commitment that this was going to be an experiment which had to work, and it worked very quickly. They had a couple of years where things looked dicey and then it picked up, and very quickly Australia became a very prosperous and healthy place. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is how the colony was not allowed to have any commerce at first. So the first commerce that was developed was illegal, thus the rum trade and all that sort of thing. And again, it was the evangelical Christians who came in and developed commerce which was based on valid principles.
Johnson moves on, of course, to reflect something else, which was very important to the evangelicals back home. This was an age where if you were poor, you didn't get an education. And if you were poor and female, you had even less chance of being given an education. They took education very seriously. And we owe the evangelicals far more for the insistence on the importance of teaching children to read and write than is given credit today. Same applies, it seems, in Australia. Richard Johnson, first man to take education seriously.
Yes, he was the first educator in Australia, first teacher. So they started the schools, and as you know, the churches were responsible for education in Australia until the Free Compulsory and Secular Education Act in New South Wales in 1880 and in other places and other dates around that time. But until 1880, the churches were responsible. But one of the more important discoveries I think we made in this book, which was an emphasis made by Canon Len Abbott, who was the person who inspired me to write this book in the first place, because he was the one who knew so much about these things. He said the state education system was the finest evangelical achievement of them all. The state education system from the Secular Education Acts of 1880 through to about 1960, those public schools were great agents of civic Protestantism. The values of those schools were all about, they were Christian values. And it was only in 1960 when the secularists started to complain about the Christian presence and started to intrude values which were not Christian, all the rest of it, the Christians thought, we've got to develop our own schools.
What do you have to say about some of the leading families, including those involved in agriculture, but also in the media, is very revealing indeed.
Yes. I mentioned one of the founders of evangelical Christianity earlier, Jonathan Edwards, the American philosopher theologian. Studies have been made of his family right through to the present, and the contribution which that guy made in terms of judges, lawyers, school teachers, ministers, even a Vice President of the United States, right down to the present, incredible. And then contrasted with a prisoner and his descendants, and they all went off the rails. Well, I got interested in this idea of Christian dynasties, families that have managed to perpetuate themselves through the generations. And there are a significant number of them in Australia, including the family of Samuel Marsden. Marsden's daughter became a major school teacher and trainer of missionaries, and a relative has been visiting Australia recently. So that's a great family. But there are families which seem to have contributed more to Australia even than the Marsdens. Like I think the most remarkable one that I found in the civic sphere is the family of Thomas Playford in South Australia. Thomas Playford was a Baptist minister who came to Australia in the 1840s, and there have been 5 or 6 Thomas Playfords since in succeeding generations, including the great Premier. Sir Thomas Playford, the Premier of South Australia, was the longest serving Premier in the Commonwealth, and a very good man, a man who was not corrupt. And I think it was one of the Archbishops of Canterbury who said to Sir Thomas Playford when he eventually lost office, "Why did you lose office, do you think?" He said, "Oh, Sir, Your Grace, I think that I was not lenient enough on gambling and alcohol consumption." So because he held the line on that, he lost office. So he's a great family. Begbie family in Sydney Anglicanism, a great Christian dynasty. The Morts, the Moores, who established Moore College. Now Moore was one who didn't establish a dynasty because he didn't have any children. But what he did was he invested in all these institutions, including Moore College, which is a very fine institution nowadays. It's library, one of the great treasures of Australia, because even though that college has a reputation for narrowness, it believes in buying every book that there is, and so it's a terrific treasure, national treasure. So culturally too, as well as theologically, I think these families are important. The Fairfax family. I mean, Sir Vincent Fairfax in our present century, I think probably the major philanthropist until terribly recently. And the Fairfax family have always been tremendously involved in Christian concerns. If you go to Pitt Street Uniting Church, which is Pitt Street Congregational Church, there's a plaque to Fairfax, and he was responsible for helping to build the building along with David Jones, another Christian family. And above the spot where the preacher preaches, the central pulpit, is the text, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." Because freedom is very important to those guys. Freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, free speech, freedom of association, the panoply of freedoms. They're all terribly important to these guys.
And they all understood that freedom exercised within a framework of responsibility perpetuates freedom. Yeah. Freedom exercised as licence destroys it and re-ensnares people. Let's follow this through a bit. So the colonies are eventually given self-governance and they move on to federation. And in many ways that process coincided with the high watermark of evangelicalism in England. There's a massive increase in the number of Anglicans in pulpits who are evangelicals, but also in the Parliament. Staggering number of people became members of Parliament from evangelical backgrounds. So Australia is developing towards becoming a country as this is reaching its peak in terms of the way or the world views of the movers and shakers in society who are about to make this nation out of a set of colonies. What's the influence, in your view, of the beliefs and the descending values out of those beliefs of evangelicalism on the formation of the modern nation that we now call Australia?
There's an aspect, a dimension of history called the history of ideas.
Yeah.
And historians like to study how ideas go from one generation to the next. And if you look at the progenitors of the ideas of federation in Australia, you'll find a lot of those thinkers, very significant thinkers, were Christians. The first person that I'm aware of who talks about the Federation of Australia is Sir James Stephen, in the Colonial Office back home. Then you get John West, who Fairfax brought over from Launceston to be editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. He was the guy who was responsible for abolishing the convict system, transportation to New South Wales and Tasmania. James Jeffress, another congregational minister in South Australia, who then became the minister in Pitt Street Congregational Church in Sydney, another advocate of federation. And the historian Alan Atkinson, in his book, says that federation wouldn't have happened were it not for the Christian ministers in New South Wales. New South Wales is a critical state. New South Wales had most to lose apparently from federation. Don't ask me why, but apparently they did. And but it was the clergy who got up in the pulpit and said, this is a great idea, we've got to have this, this is a wonderful thing, this will give us the opportunity to really become a nation which honours God. This is progressing the kingdom of God on earth and that sort of thing. Another historian, Hurst, says that God wanted Australia to be a federation. Quite an incredible comment for an historian to make. But sure, the churches were very involved in the movement towards federation. Key players. And in the Constitution itself, in the wording of the Constitution, also important. And the naming of Australia as a commonwealth. It's a very precious word to a lot of people. A word taken from Oliver Cromwell. Canada, for example, calls itself a dominion, which doesn't quite sound quite as free, does it, as a commonwealth? And Australia is a commonwealth. So yeah, the wording, the naming, the support for it, the churches were way behind it, or well behind it.
Stuart, to end off where we began, history is important. It's the chart we need to take the vessel of our modern community through difficult waters. And we depend, though, not just on the charts being there, but they need to be accurate. History needs to be true. There's been a lot of history revisionism and a lot of leaving out of important aspects of history, I believe, in Australia in recent years.
Yes, and the reason for it is that the humanities no longer believe in truth. They no longer believe in reality. They believe all those things are subjective. I was very struck by the recent awarding of the Australian of the Year to that scientist who spoke all the time about reality. And I thought, this is not something that we in humanities ever speak about. And the senior Australian of the Year, another scientist, spoke about the pursuit of truth. And I thought, this is not what humanities speak about. We don't talk about truth or reality anymore. We believe that it's all subjective. But there's probably a much closer link between real science and real history than we realise, and they both are interested in truth. They're both interested in reality. They're both interested in human experience, which is where we began. History is a study of human experience, and if we're going to have any grasp of reality, then we've got to study history, I think.
So on that note, I'd like to say I've enjoyed this conversation enormously. I hope others will as well.
Thank you, John.
And there's a really, really important point here. I was staggered by some of the simple facts that you unearthed. They appear to me have about them the ring of truth. I don't see how people could argue that they're not true. Given, therefore, that much of your work is very challenging to the modern narrative, where we want to airbrush out the contribution of people of faith in particular, I think there's a great challenge here, frankly, for all of us. Are we mature enough to grapple with the facts, to grapple with the arguments, to honestly draw conclusions out of them, or will we resort to the sort of glib moral relativism that I think is perhaps one of the greatest threats of all to our freedom as a society? This is a magnificent piece of work, and it's only the first volume. I certainly hope that it's widely read and widely and honestly debated.
Thank you, John. Very kind.